Today, I want to invite each one of you to join me in my journey when I was diagnosed with breast cancer in August of 2016, and how I found a way to heal naturally. And today, I am 100% cancer-free. I was born in the 1950s into a family that I would call the perfect family, but we all know there's no such thing as a perfect family. My family believed in hard work, and if you didn't know how to do something, you researched it until you figured it out. It wasn't until I was diagnosed with breast cancer that I realized that maybe this was the perfect family. Because when I was faced with the dire prospects of what the medical community was presenting to me, I knew that I had to find another way. The first thing my oncologist did was referred me to a radiologist. And I remember that day. It was a beautiful summer day, and I love summertime. I love the birds that sing in the trees. I love the flowers that bloom. I can still smell the roses. But on this particular day, I found myself driving into a parking lot. I found a place to park. And as I got out of my car and walked up to the door and stepped inside, I was greeted by the receptionist who told me to have a seat in the waiting room. As I sat in the waiting room and I looked around at all the hopelessness on the faces of the people that sat in that room, it was hard to breathe. Finally, my name was called, and I was led into this little room where I sat in this hard metal chair in the corner, and I waited for the doctor to come in. When the doctor finally came in, he was a strange-looking man. And as I looked into his face, I don't know if it was the tone of his voice or the look in his eyes, but I felt like a fly who had been caught in a spider web. He proceeded to tell me the procedure for radiation. Don't worry, your breast will get a little burnt, but it'll heal. We try really hard not to get your heart and lungs, but there's no guarantee. So I said, what happens to the tissue inside your breast? Does that heal also? No, that will always remain radiated tissue. It will be hard and lumpy. I knew in that moment that I was not going down that path. When I left his office that day, I felt completely devastated. I drove myself home, where I found myself all alone, and I started to sink into a deep despair. And in that dark night of my soul, I knew I had two options. I could go the traditional medical route, or I could find another way to heal. And as I was swirling around in that darkness, I heard this voice in the back of my head that said, if you have the faith of a grain of mustard seed, you can move mountains. And I knew in that moment that I would find a way. I didn't know how, I didn't know what it was going to be, but I would find a way. And the very next day, a series of events unfolded that led me to a nutritionist, an integrated doctor, and a naturopath oncologist. And these three incredible women all had a very important message for me, that if I truly wanted to heal, it was about healing my body, my mind, and my spirit. So I began to eat foods that were good for my body, foods that would actually kill cancer cells, build up my immune system. Simple things like strawberries and walnuts. And I began to avoid foods that actually cause inflammation in your body, weaken your immune system, and feed cancer cells. Things like processed foods that contain so many chemicals that our bodies cannot process at all. And the number one thing the cancer feeds on, sugar. So as I began to feel stronger in my body, and I wasn't even consciously aware of it, but I knew it was time to work on my mind and my spirit. I started having visions of the day I was born. And I saw that little girl full of hope and joy. She sparkled, and I was in awe of her. And then I had a memory of when I was 9 years old. And when I was 9 years old, my parents divorced. Lives were shattered, hearts were broken, and we as children just sat there and watched. And in that moment, I made a decision that I would do everything in my power to make my mother smile again. So as I was swirling around in that vortex of emotion, I knew that I had to find a way to step out of that and get a different perspective. So I decided to step into a helicopter. It was like watching a movie, the actors on the stage. And I realized in that moment that I had sacrificed that little girl who had hopes and dreams of her own. There was nothing I could do to change anything that happened that day. I didn't have the power. Today I do things a little bit differently. I look at things from a whole different perspective. But what I realized in that moment was that I had created a belief that I was still carrying with me today. And just that one belief had recreated things in my life that were manifesting in ways that I wasn't even aware of. For years, I continually picked poor relationships. I picked men who were broken because I thought I could fix them. I had all the keys. For many years, I worked as a professional, a very successful professional in the senior housing industry. I knew how to make those people money. The owners loved me. I knew all the right things to do. But what I realized is that I abandoned that little girl and I locked her away in a closet. I had become a robot. But today, I don't lock that little girl away anymore. Instead, I ask her things like, what makes you happy? Things that make her happy, like four-wheel driving with my daughter and my grandchildren. Adventuring to the Amazon in the middle of the night and hunting for alligators. Who knew? The reason I'm telling you this today, why it's so important for you to eat good food and take good care of your body and know what kind of emotions you're carrying in your body, is that about 10 years ago, they started studying what's called epigenetics. Epigenetics is a study of how our genes send a sequence to our DNA and tell our DNA what to feed the cells. So we all know we have cells in our body, right? And we all know that in those cells is our DNA. And we all know in that DNA are our genes. And our genes are impacted by what you eat. Are you getting enough sleep? How much stress do you have in your life? And those genes trigger the DNA to either create healthy cells or allow disease in your body. I'm not telling you this today because just to people who have disease. It's not about me healing from cancer. It's about you living your lives to the fullest so that we together collectively can leave a legacy of healthy living to our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. I didn't know how far I had come until one day, about 2 months ago, my granddaughter asked me if I would give 2 of her friends a ride home. The girls were sitting in the back seat, and the 2 girls were talking about how they wished they had a grandmother they could talk to. And I heard my granddaughter say, "My grandma is the coolest." You dropped the 2 girls off, and as we drove away, my granddaughter looked at me and said, "Grandma, you really are my role model." Those words went straight into my heart. There's nothing to me more precious in this whole world than to know that I'm making an impact in my granddaughter's life. So my challenge to you today is, what are you putting into your body that's telling your DNA what to do? And are you living a fulfilled life? And do you do what truly makes you happy? Thank you.